Hi everyone, welcome to another workshop presented to you by the Writing Support Center. My name is Genesis. I'm one of the faculty here at the Writing Support Center, and today we're going to do our new and improved series and reviewing our thesis statement workshop. As mentioned in past new and improved videos, we are always looking for ways to improve here at the Writing Support Center, whether that's in our presentation method, adding additional information, updating the worksheets, etc. So we are currently going to redo this video. So before we get started, we do want to review some of the expectations to help you get the most out of this workshop. First and foremost, we do ask that you complete the accompanying activity worksheet. This is especially important if you are receiving extra credit on the assignment, or if this is a part of a class activity. You do need to fill out the accompanying worksheet in order to get full credit. And then secondly, we also ask that you take your time. Feel free to pause and rewind parts that were either confusing or went way too fast. That's the beauty of having these video workshops, is you get to take your time with them. So, a quick outline of what we will be discussing today. So we're going to go over what is a thesis statement, along with what are the different parts of a thesis statement. We're also going to be talking about the types of thesis statements, what you should avoid while writing one, some brainstorming strategies, and then lastly, how to check your thesis statement to make sure that it is strong and outlining what you'll be discussing in your essay. So before we get started, we do want to do a quick check-in reflection activity. Again, you can find this activity on the accompanying worksheet found in the module. And in the space provided, I just want you to answer the following questions. What do you already know about thesis statements? And why is it important to have a strong thesis? So take some time to fill out those, to answer those questions. So the purpose of the thesis statement, we want to know why they're important, why we always insist on making sure that you have one in your essay. And first and foremost, it's because it's your main argument and focus of the essay. It tells your reader of your opinion on the topic and the issue and what you'll be discussing throughout the essay. And it also makes an assertion or a claim about a topic. So it presents a stance, it presents a viewpoint, a framework, and a lens. And that is really important to help guide your essay, and it gives it some focus. And which is part of the reason why it's important. So first and foremost, it provides a roadmap for the reader. So if the reader is able to pinpoint the thesis, they're aware of what you'll be talking about and what you're trying to support or prove throughout your essay. It also helps keep you, the writer, on track. So sometimes when we're writing, we hit those points where we feel stuck, or we're wondering, I don't even know if this is supporting my thesis anymore, or if this is contributing to the overall essay. So having a strong thesis, or a clear thesis, really helps you as a writer go and make sure, oh yes, it's clicking, or no, it's not, I'm on a tangent, so I need to rework this. So it really is also helpful for you, the writer. As I mentioned before, it presents your ideas to the reader, so the reader knows what to expect from your essay. It also gives strength to your argument because it presents a clear argument, and it creates an expectation in the reader's mind because the reader will know what you're going to be arguing. Some common misconceptions or myths that we often hear about thesis. So the first is that we often hear, when we first learn about thesis statements in high school, we're told that they tend to be a sentence long and are always at the end of the intro paragraph. This isn't always true. Depending on the type of essay that you're writing, you may need to put it at the beginning of the intro and then sort of work from specific to general. as your paper grows longer, it can be longer than one sentence because sometimes one sentence is not enough to convey all of the information that you're going to be focusing on. So those are some common myths that we hear. And, as you go along in your writing career, your academic career, you're more than welcome to have it be a little longer. As I mentioned earlier, depending on the type of essay, your thesis might be at a different part of the essay. So it might not always be in the intro. Sometimes it'll also be in the conclusion. Another myth that we hear is that the first thesis you submit is the thesis that you must keep throughout the entire time. That is not true. Sometimes as we're writing, our ideas develop a little more. We find additional research to support our points. And so our thesis may change a little bit, and that's totally fine. Your thesis should always reflect your final essay. So sometimes that means going back, editing it, changing it a little bit, making it more specific or more detailed in order to ensure that it's fully reflecting what you're writing about. Another myth is that you cannot use the word because. I actually encourage you to use the word because, especially when you're brainstorming your essay or just starting out with your rough drafts. It's really helpful. It's a good sentence starter, and it just helps you come up with your ideas. As you go along in your drafts, that might change. You might end up rewording it because there might be a smoother way to write it, but you're also more than welcome to use the word because in your essays. Another myth that we hear is that a thesis has to have 3 reasons. You can have one reason that's large enough to expand upon throughout your essay. You can have more reasons. It doesn't have to be limited to 3. This comes out of the standard 5-paragraph essay model, which you will most likely be moving away from the more you write in your undergraduate and academic career. And that it has to be a list of reasons. You don't have to list it out. If there's a cleaner way to sort of bring out all the reasonings and put it in a sense a little more generalized into your thesis, that could work too. So don't feel like it has to be 3 reasons or that it has to be presented in a list. It really is whatever is going to best reflect your essay. So with that being said, now that we know a little more about the thesis statement, we really want to talk about, okay, well, how do I start writing this? And the first thing that you want to keep in mind is that there are 3 parts to a thesis statement. So every strong and clear thesis statement has these 3 parts in some way or another. The first is the subject, the who or what your essay is going to be about. Your reader should have a clear idea of what it is that you'll be focusing on in your essay. So an example here is the Civil War. We want to focus about the North and the South. And as a reader, if I see that, I know that that's what the essay is going to be focusing on throughout. The second thing that the second part of a thesis statement is the argument or claim, which is the main focus of the essay. So this is what you're either trying to prove or you're trying to explore in your thesis. And in this example, is fought the Civil War for similar and different reasons. So we know that it's a little vague, it's a little general right now, but that's totally fine. This is just a rough draft. But this is what we're going to explore is the reasons why the North and the South fought in the Civil War. And then the last part, and this is the important part because this is the part that differentiates your thesis from being a thesis as opposed to just an opinion or another statement, and that is the reasoning. Your thesis statement should answer either the how, why, or so what. And so in this example, we have they believed they were right. So it answers why did they fight? Because if if we're stating that they fought the civil wars for different reasons, we want to know, okay, but why? So what? how. So your reasoning is tied to your argument. Once you make your claim, you want to make sure that you're answering the why, how, or so what, and that'll put together your thesis. Um, And as you're putting these together, I always recommend just putting together some sort of diagram that helps you list out those reasons. And as I mentioned earlier, those previous statements may have sounded a little more general, and that's totally fine because as you're drafting, as you're brainstorming, you're still constructing everything, you're putting everything together. And you end up developing what is called a working thesis. So this is a thesis that is not finalized. This is a thesis that is flexible, open to evolving, and will be edited and revised throughout your different drafts. And so I recommend that you have a working thesis versus a set thesis. So oftentimes um, a mistake that often happens is that students will opt for a set thesis, which is a thesis that is unrevised and you use it from beginning to end. It doesn't get edited, it doesn't get revised, it doesn't reflect the final paper that you turn in, and it's a lot harder to work with and can result in writer's block. And sometimes the reason we are sort of nervous to revise our thesis statements is because we feel like we have to start over. If we change it, we suddenly have to change the whole paper, and that's not always the case. Sometimes it's the paper and the ideas have evolved, and so the thesis should reflect that. So you can go back to your thesis, edit your thesis to better reflect the product that you're working on. So you always want to make sure that you're having a working thesis because this thesis is open to revision, it's open to changing, and is going to best reflect the final essay that you turn in. And so there are two examples of what this looks like. So with the set thesis is the thesis that we had presented on the earlier slide. The North and South fought the Civil War for many similar and different reasons because they believed they were right. It's a little general. There's so many different ways that you can write this. And the while this is a thesis, it has all three parts. It doesn't really provide much information to the reader. However, if we go to the working thesis, we add a little more specification, we add a little more detail. Suddenly, the thesis reads, while both sides fought the Civil War over the issue of slavery, the North fought for moral reasons, while the South fought to preserve its own institutions. So suddenly we added a little more of a focus. We added the issue of slavery. That's one of the bigger focuses that happened. We added one specific reason that the writer will be exploring for the North and another specific reason for the South. So it narrows down the topics a little more. So this is more along the right track. It gives the reader a little more of a clearer picture of what will be discussed. And then of course you just continue editing. And finally when you put it all together, it could read and revise it. It could read something more along the lines of, while both Northerners and Southerners believed they fought against oppression and tyranny, Northerners focused on the oppression of slaves, while Southerners defended state rights. So we added a little more focus. We specified certain areas a little more to make sure that it would reflect the final essay. And so now as a reader, you have a clearer idea of the different elements that are going to be discussed in the essay. And as a writer, you also know exactly what you're focusing on. And when you get stuck, you're just able to go back to those points. So when you're writing, I kind of mentioned this a little bit when we were discussing the revisions, but there are a couple things that you want to avoid in your thesis, and the first is vagueness. So in the initial example of a set thesis, one of the things that I mentioned was that it's a little vague, and this just means that you're not really specifying exactly what you're going to be talking about, or it may seem like there's too many different ways that the sentence can be interpreted. So you want to make sure that your thesis statement is as specific as possible, in order to um, give guidance and really be that roadmap for the reader. Um, you also want to make sure that you're avoiding fluff words. So, fluff words are words that contribute to vagueness. They don't really provide a lot of information. An example would be good, bad, many, a lot. You want to make sure that if you're implementing those types of words into your thesis statement was something more specific or more accurate, to what you'll be discussing in your essay. You also want to make sure you're not too specific. So you're really working with the Goldilocks effect when you're writing your thesis. You don't want it to be too general where there's too many directions that you can write, where you can write your essay. So you don't want it to be too vague, but you also don't want it to be too specific, because then that will limit uh, the amount of research that you can talk about, or the amount of detail you can go into, because you just have such a narrow topic. You want to make sure that you're somewhere right in the middle, where you're um, general enough to where you're able to talk about multiple items, but also specific enough where your reader doesn't feel like there's just too much that you're trying to cover in a short amount of space. You also want to avoid just having a topic, observation, or title as your thesis. So again, you want to make sure that it has all three parts of the subject, the argument, and the reasoning. When you just have a topic or a title, when you just have a topic, you're just claiming the subject. When you just have an observation, you're just having the subject and the argument or claim. And when you just have a title, that might not even be a complete sentence. So you want to make sure that you have all three parts of a thesis statement in order to avoid having just a topic, observation, or title. You also want to avoid using I statements. So saying something along the lines of, in this paper, I will um, fill in the blank. That could be a good sentence starter when you're drafting your thesis statement and just trying to figure out what you're going to write about. However, most disciplines ask for it to be written in the third person. But also check in with your professor, or check in with the area of study that you're writing in. There are some disciplines that allow you to write in the first person. An example would be philosophy, because they really want to get your point of view on the topic. Another thing that you want to avoid is the concept of playing it neutral. Your thesis, you really want to make sure that you're taking a stance, because you want to make sure that it's your thesis is arguable. There could be an opposing side, so when you're trying to play it neutral, it kind of eliminates that possibility. And then lastly, you want to avoid using a question as your thesis. So as the writer, you're the one sharing with everyone, sharing with your reader your thoughts. So the minute that you pose it as a question, you're giving the reader the opportunity to provide their interpretation and fill in the blanks for themselves, rather than you telling them what you think about the topic. So you really want to make sure that you're avoiding using questions as your thesis, because we're looking to you to tell us what you think. All right, so now we're going to go into our thesis statement activity. So again, this is found on the accompanying worksheet that's in the module. Create your own thesis statements based on the prompts provided. If you would like to use prompts from your class, feel free to do so. Make sure your thesis has a topic, an argument or claim, and a reasoning. So now that we know the different parts of a thesis statement, what we want to make sure it has and what we want to avoid when writing our thesis statements. There are a couple of brainstorming strategies that can help you just start getting your thoughts out for your paper. So the first is identify a topic and learn more about it. So it's really helpful when you choose a topic that you're passionate about or interested in learning more about. And learning more about a topic can help you form the opinion that you want to write about in your essay. So sometimes part of the reason that we have a hard time developing our thesis statement is because we don't really know much about the topic that we're being asked to write about. So just doing that extra little bit of research can really help you sort of narrow down your ideas, formulate your ideas, create a question that you're interested in answering, and then that'll help you brainstorm some thesis statements. Uh, Another strategy that you can use is the use of a purpose statement. So saying something along the lines of, in this essay, I will prove, and then tell us what you want to prove. Like I said, you're more than welcome to edit your thesis statement uh, throughout your drafts. So this is just a good way to get your ideas out, what you want to talk about, and then just going back and editing it as you submit your drafts to your professor. A third brainstorming strategy is asking questions. So questions can help serve as a guide of what you want to answer in the essay. So what did you want to learn more about? And asking questions like why, how, so what, and then that'll also help you just begin to formulate different ideas for your thesis. Finally, creating a list, listing the things that you want to know or talk about in your essay. And so doing all of that can really just help you get your ideas out. And you're sort of working backwards, listing out what you're going to talk about, and then trying to see, like, okay, what is the relationship between all of these ideas? And then using that to come up with your thesis. So, methods to review. So before you say yes to the thesis and say like, this is my final thesis, this is what I'm going to turn into my professor, you want to make sure you check it. And a couple of ways to check it is by reviewing it with your professor or a tutor, just checking in with them to see if you're on the right track, and making sure that it answers the prompt. Because one thing you should always keep in mind is that your thesis is a response to the prompt that is being given to you. So usually if your professor presents you with a question, your thesis statement should be a response to that question. You also want to make sure that it's arguable. Like I said, you don't want to play a neutral stance. You want to make sure that there is two sides to the thesis statement, and this will open up room for engagement, and just really allow you to add some complexities to your writing. You want to ask yourself, is it specific enough but not limiting? So are you able to do enough research, get enough resources for the work cited, etc.? Does it pass the so what test? So when you read the thesis, this is really helpful. It's really helpful if you ask someone else to read it for you, and asking them if they know what you're going to talk about. Sometimes if you ask your tutor, like, um, is my thesis thorough? And you just want to make sure that they're not asking so what or how and why. So if you're reading it, when you read it, do you ask yourself, so what? If you ask yourself, so what, it means that you need to clarify the reasoning or add a reasoning. If you're asking how and why, it means that, again, you just need to add a reasoning. So to summarize, all essays have a thesis statement, a main argument that guides the essay and the reader and you, the writer. A thesis statement consists of three parts: a subject, an argument or claim, and a reasoning. And you want to make sure that you're aiming for your thesis statement to be specific enough to narrow the subject, but also general enough to give a variety of what to write about. And as always, if you ever have any questions or you're stuck on writing your thesis statement, you need some help brainstorming, you're more than welcome to come to the Writing Support Center. Our tutors are more than happy to help you. We are open Monday through Thursday from 9 a.m. to 7 p.m. and on Fridays from 9 a.m. to 2 p.m. It's as easy as clicking a button. Just go to our website, click on the Meet with the Tutor button, and it'll take you straight to our Zoom room where our tutors are happy to help. Thank you all and have a wonderful day.